When we watch The Lion King, we see Mufasa as the perfect father and king, sharing profound wisdom with young Simba during those precious morning hours. But here's what most fans never consider. Those few lessons we witness represent only a fraction of what royal education actually entailed in the Pride Lands. The tragic reality is that Simba's education was brutally cut short, and the consequences of that interrupted learning shaped not just his reign but the entire future of the Pride Lands. Most viewers remember the iconic scenes: Mufasa teaching Simba about the circle of life, showing him the kingdom from Pride Rock, explaining the delicate balance of nature. These moments feel complete, like a finished education, but they're actually just the beginning chapters of what should have been a comprehensive royal curriculum that would have taken years to complete. Consider what we know about Mufasa's own background. Historical evidence from the extended Pride Lands lore suggests that Mufasa was trained not just in philosophy and basic leadership, but in complex systems of governance that most fans never see on screen. His father Ahadi was reportedly one of the most sophisticated rulers in Pride Lands history, known for implementing intricate diplomatic protocols and resource management systems that kept the kingdom stable for decades. The depth of this lost knowledge becomes apparent when we analyze Mufasa's brief interactions with other characters. Watch closely how he handles the morning report from Zazu. It's not just casual conversation. Mufasa processes information about weather patterns, animal migration schedules, territorial disputes, and resource distribution with the efficiency of someone who's been trained in systematic kingdom management. He asks specific questions that reveal an understanding of interconnected systems that goes far beyond what he ever had time to teach Simba. But here's where it gets interesting. When we examine Simba's actual education, we see a curriculum that was barely started. The morning patrol teachings focused on basic territory awareness and the philosophical concept of the circle of life. Important foundations certainly, but equivalent to teaching someone to read without ever showing them how to write, analyze, or create literature. Simba learned the what and some of the why, but never the how. The evidence for this incomplete education appears throughout Simba's adult life, though it's often disguised as character flaws or personal growth challenges. Take his initial reaction to becoming king again. He doesn't seamlessly step into complex royal duties. Instead, he relies heavily on advisors like Rafiki and Zazu to fill in massive knowledge gaps. This isn't just about being rusty from years in exile. This is about fundamental systems and protocols that he never learned in the first place. Even more telling is how Simba approaches major kingdom challenges. His responses are often reactive rather than proactive, emotional rather than systematic. When faced with the outsider situation, for instance, Simba's approach is essentially banish the problem and hope it goes away. A fully educated royal leader would have had training in conflict resolution, diplomatic negotiation, and long-term, more strategic thinking that could have prevented the crisis from escalating to war. The morning patrol scene, beautiful as it is, represents maybe 5% of what royal education should have included. Missing from Simba's interrupted learning were crucial modules in diplomatic protocol, economic resource management, crisis response procedures, psychological leadership techniques, and the complex art of managing diverse populations with conflicting needs. What makes this particularly tragic is that Mufasa clearly understood these advanced concepts. His brief reign demonstrates sophisticated leadership skills that suggest he received comprehensive royal training. The way he balances different animal groups, manages territorial disputes, and maintains stability indicates knowledge of systems that took years to master. Knowledge that perished with him, leaving Simba to figure out kingship through trial and error rather than systematic preparation. This incomplete education theory explains many of the puzzling aspects of Simba's reign that fans often overlook. Why did problems with the outsiders escalate to civil war? Why did Simba struggle with overprotective parenting? Why did he seem unprepared for challenges that Mufasa would have handled smoothly? The answer lies not in character weaknesses, but in educational gaps that were never filled. The implications extend beyond just Simba's personal struggles. An incompletely trained king creates ripple effects throughout the kingdom, affecting everything from resource allocation to diplomatic relationships to the preparation of the next generation. Understanding this lost education reveals why certain problems in the Pride Lands seem to persist or resurface throughout Simba's reign, despite his good intentions and natural leadership abilities. The most overlooked aspect of Mufasa's lost curriculum involves the sophisticated art of royal diplomacy. a complex system of inter-kingdom relationships that most fans never realize existed in the Pride Lands. The evidence for these diplomatic protocols appears in subtle details throughout the films, but their absence from Simba's education created some of the most serious long-term consequences of his incomplete training. Careful analysis of Mufasa's brief appearances reveals a king who understood diplomacy at levels that extend far beyond simple animal communication. Notice how different species approach Mufasa during the presentation ceremony. The systematic arrangement isn't random pageantry, but evidence of established diplomatic hierarchies. The elephants arrive in specific formations, the giraffes maintain particular distances, and even the positioning of various animal groups follows protocols that suggest complex interspecies agreements. These diplomatic relationships required constant maintenance through what royal scholars would recognize as a sophisticated system of reciprocal obligations, territorial agreements, and resource-sharing protocols. Mufasa didn't just rule over animals. He maintained active diplomatic relationships with semi-autonomous animal kingdoms that had their own internal leadership structures. The elephant herds, for instance, had their own matriarchal leadership system that required delicate negotiation to maintain peaceful coexistence. But here's what makes Simba's educational gap so significant. Diplomatic protocol in the animal kingdom operates on completely different principles than human diplomacy. Animal diplomatic relationships are built on complex understanding of instinctual behaviors, territorial psychology, seasonal migration patterns, and resource competition cycles. This knowledge requires years of study and practice to master effectively. Mufasa demonstrated this sophisticated understanding in his brief interactions with different species. His communication with Zazu isn't just convenient plot device. It represents a formal diplomatic relationship with the bird kingdoms that required specific protocols and mutual obligations. The hornbills served as official messengers and intelligence gatherers, but this arrangement required maintaining delicate balances of trust, information sharing, and territorial respect. The absence of this diplomatic education becomes glaringly obvious when we examine Simba's handling of the outsider crisis. His approach, immediate banishment without negotiation, violates every principle of effective animal kingdom diplomacy. A properly trained royal leader would have recognized that Zira's group represented a displaced population with legitimate grievances that required diplomatic resolution, not military action. Consider how Mufasa might have approached the same situation. Rather than reactive banishment, diplomatic protocol would have involved systematic assessment of the outsider's actual concerns, negotiation of territorial arrangements that address their needs while protecting Pride Land interests, and establishment of monitoring agreements that prevented future conflicts. The goal of animal kingdom diplomacy isn't elimination of opposition, but integration of diverse groups into stable coexistence. Simba's diplomatic failures extend beyond just the outsider situation. His relationships with neighboring animal kingdoms show consistent patterns of reactive rather than proactive management. When problems arise, his approach typically involves direct confrontation or avoidance, rather than the sophisticated negotiation techniques that maintain long-term stability. Even more troubling is how these diplomatic failures affected the next generation. Kiara's initial isolation from other animal groups wasn't just overprotective parenting. It represented a breakdown in traditional diplomatic socialization that should have prepared her for complex inter-kingdom relationships. A properly educated king would have understood that royal children require exposure to diverse animal communities as part of their diplomatic training. The irony is that some of Simba's apparent moral victories were actually diplomatic disasters in disguise. His eventual acceptance of the outsiders, while emotionally satisfying for audiences, came only after unnecessary conflict that could have been prevented through proper diplomatic intervention years earlier. A trained diplomatic leader would have identified and addressed the underlying territorial and resource issues before they escalated to civil war. This pattern repeats throughout Simba's reign. Problems that should have been resolved through quiet diplomatic channels instead escalated into dramatic confrontations that, while cinematically compelling, represented fundamental failures of preventive leadership. The elephant graveyard incidents, various territorial disputes, and even some of the challenges faced by Keon's Lion Guard could have been minimized through proper diplomatic management. The most significant consequence of this missing diplomatic education appears in how it affected the Pride Land's regional stability. Mufasa's reign was characterized by peaceful relationships with neighboring territories, but historical evidence suggests that these relationships required constant diplomatic maintenance that Simba never learned to provide. The result was gradual erosion of inter-kingdom cooperation that created vulnerabilities exploited by hostile forces throughout his reign. Understanding these diplomatic failures reveals why certain problems seemed to persist in the Pride Lands, despite Simba's best efforts. Good intentions cannot substitute for systematic diplomatic knowledge, and the absence of proper training created recurring crises that a fully educated king would have prevented through proactive relationship management. The diplomatic gaps in Simba's education pale in comparison to his complete lack of training in what might be termed the science of kingdom management. The systematic approach to resource allocation, population balance, and crisis prevention that formed the backbone of effective Pride Lands governance. This missing knowledge created some of the most serious challenges of his reign, problems that audiences often attribute to external forces but which actually stemmed from fundamental gaps in administrative understanding. Mufasa's brief reign demonstrates mastery of incredibly complex resource management systems that most viewers never fully appreciate. The Pride Lands weren't just a territory where animals lived freely, they operated as a carefully balanced ecosystem, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment. Water sources needed to be maintained and distributed fairly among competing populations. Grazing areas required rotation to prevent overuse. Hunting territories needed careful regulation to maintain prey populations while meeting predator needs. The evidence for these sophisticated systems appears in subtle details throughout Mufasa's scenes. His morning discussions with Zazu aren't casual conversations about kingdom gossip. They're systematic briefings on resource status, population movements, and environmental conditions. Mufasa processes information about rainfall patterns, migration schedules, and territorial disputes with the efficiency of someone trained in comprehensive resource management protocols. But here's what makes Simba's knowledge gap so devastating. These systems require not just understanding, but active management. Kingdom administration in the Pride Lands meant making dozens of daily decisions about resource allocation, territorial adjustments, and population balance. Without proper training in these systems, a king becomes purely reactive, responding to crises rather than preventing them through proactive management. The clearest evidence of this gap appears during the drought challenges that affected the Pride Lands during Simba's reign. His response to water shortages was essentially to wait for rain and hope for the best, a passive approach that would have been unthinkable for a properly trained royal administrator. Mufasa's generation would have had detailed protocols for drought management, including pre-established agreements with neighboring territories for resource sharing, systematic conservation measures, and population redistribution plans to reduce pressure on limited water sources. Even more telling is how Simba handled the complex population dynamics that define Pride Lands ecology. The delicate balance between predator and prey populations requires constant monitoring and occasional intervention to prevent system collapse. Mufasa understood these relationships at a level that allowed him to make subtle adjustments that maintained stability. Simba's approach was largely to let natural processes handle themselves, which works in normal conditions but creates disasters during stress periods. The territorial management failures become particularly obvious when examining the recurring boundary disputes throughout Simba's reign. Proper kingdom administration requires maintaining detailed knowledge of territorial agreements, seasonal usage patterns, and resource-sharing protocols between different animal groups. Without this knowledge, minor boundary issues escalate into major conflicts that could have been prevented through systematic administrative intervention. Consider the elephant graveyard situation. Not just the initial incident with young Simba, but the ongoing territorial issues that persisted throughout his reign. A properly trained king would have established clear protocols for managing this sensitive area, including regular diplomatic consultation with elephant leadership, systematic monitoring of boundary violations, and proactive measures to prevent unauthorized access. Instead, the area remained a recurring source of conflict that required repeated crisis intervention. The hyena situation provides another clear example of administrative failure. Rather than developing systematic approaches to integrate or manage displaced hyena populations, Simba's administration relied on reactive banishment policies that created ongoing instability. Proper resource management would have recognized that hyenas fill important ecological roles and developed sustainable solutions that addressed both their needs and kingdom security concerns. These administrative gaps created cascading effects throughout the Pride Lands' ecological and social systems. Without proper resource management, minor environmental challenges became major crises. Without systematic population monitoring, small territorial disputes escalated into serious conflicts. Without proactive crisis prevention protocols, problems that should have been resolved quietly through administrative channels instead required dramatic interventions that disrupted kingdom stability. The most serious consequence of these missing administrative skills appears in how they affected long-term kingdom sustainability. Mufasa's brief reign suggests understanding of systems that could maintain Pride Land stability across generations. Simba's reactive approach, while often successful in resolving immediate crises, failed to establish the systematic foundations necessary for long-term stability. This pattern becomes particularly evident when comparing crisis response styles. Mufasa's approach to challenges appears to have been based on systematic protocols that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Simba's crisis management, while often heroic and emotionally satisfying for audiences, typically focused on immediate problems without addressing underlying systemic issues that cause them. The irony is that many of the challenges that defined Simba's reign as dramatic and heroic were actually preventable through proper administrative management. The outsider crisis, various territorial disputes, resource shortages, and population conflicts that created compelling storylines were largely the result of administrative gaps that systematic kingdom management could have prevented. The most psychologically complex aspect of Simba's incomplete education involves what royal leadership scholars would recognize as the sophisticated understanding of power psychology. The intricate knowledge of how authority actually functions in complex social systems. This represents perhaps the most subtle yet devastating gap in his training because it affected every relationship and decision throughout his reign in ways that most observers never fully recognize. Mufasa demonstrated mastery of psychological leadership principles that extend far beyond simple dominance or inherited authority. His interactions with different characters reveal understanding of what motivates various personality types, how to establish genuine respect rather than mere compliance, and how to manage the complex emotional dynamics that determine whether a kingdom thrives or merely survives. These skills require years of study and practice to develop effectively. The evidence for this sophisticated psychological understanding appears in how different animals responded to Mufasa's presence. It wasn't just fear or respect for his position. It was genuine psychological connection that inspired voluntary cooperation rather than forced obedience. Watch how Zazu interacts with Mufasa versus how he behaves around Simba. With Mufasa, there's natural synchronization and anticipation of needs. With Simba, there's often confusion, hesitation, and the need for explicit instruction. This difference reveals that royal authority in the Pride Lands operated on psychological principles rather than just hierarchical position. Mufasa understood how to read animal psychology, anticipate behavioral patterns, and adjust his communication style to connect effectively with different personality types. He knew how to inspire confidence in uncertain situations, manage conflict between strong personalities, and maintain group cohesion during stressful periods. But here's what makes Simba's psychological education gap so significant. These skills become increasingly important as leadership challenges become more complex. Basic authority might suffice for simple situations, but managing sophisticated political conflicts, negotiating with hostile parties, and maintaining kingdom stability during crisis periods requires advanced psychological understanding that Simba never developed. The clearest evidence of this gap appears in Simba's relationship management throughout his reign. His interactions with advisors, family members, and kingdom inhabitants consistently show patterns of psychological miscommunication that created unnecessary conflicts and missed opportunities for effective leadership. His overprotective relationship with Kiara, for instance, wasn't just personal parenting anxiety. It represented fundamental misunderstanding of how authority and trust interact in royal family dynamics. A properly trained royal leader would have understood that overprotection actually undermines the psychological development necessary for effective future leadership. Kiara needed exposure to calculated risks and decision-making challenges to develop the psychological resilience required for royal responsibilities. Simba's protective instincts, while emotionally understandable, prevented her from receiving the psychological training that his own incomplete education made him unable to recognize she needed. Even more revealing is how Simba handled psychological manipulation from hostile forces. The outsider crisis succeeded partially because Zira understood psychological warfare principles that Simba had never learned to recognize or counter. Her manipulation of Kovu, systematic undermining of Pride Land stability, and exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities in the kingdom's social structure represented sophisticated psychological strategies that required equally sophisticated defensive responses. Mufasa's generation would have been trained to recognize these psychological attack patterns and respond with systematic counter strategies that addressed both immediate threats and underlying psychological vulnerabilities. Simba's reactive approach, while eventually successful, allowed the psychological damage to spread much further than necessary before implementing effective countermeasures. The psychological leadership gaps become particularly obvious when examining how Simba managed internal kingdom conflicts. His tendency toward emotional decision-making rather than psychological analysis meant that many disputes escalated unnecessarily because he responded to surface behaviors rather than underlying psychological motivations. Proper psychological training would have enabled him to identify root causes of conflicts and address them through targeted psychological intervention rather than broad disciplinary action. Perhaps most significantly, Simba's incomplete psychological education affected how he processed his own trauma and its impact on his leadership effectiveness. The psychological skills that would have helped him manage the effects of his father's loss, his years in exile, and the stress of sudden royal responsibility were never developed. This created a psychological leadership style that was heavily influenced by unprocessed emotional reactions rather than systematic psychological understanding. The connection between personal psychological gaps and leadership failures becomes clear when analyzing Simba's decision-making patterns. His choices often reflected emotional reactions to immediate situations, rather than psychological analysis of long-term consequences. This reactive psychological pattern created recurring leadership challenges that proper psychological training could have prevented. The most troubling aspect of these psychological leadership gaps is how they affected the next generation's preparation. Both Kiara and Kion show evidence of receiving incomplete psychological leadership training, suggesting that Simba's own educational gaps prevented him from providing the systematic psychological preparation that effective royal leadership requires. This psychological dimension reveals why many of Simba's leadership challenges persisted, despite his good intentions and natural leadership abilities. Psychological authority cannot be developed through experience alone. It requires systematic training in understanding motivation, managing complex personality dynamics, and maintaining psychological stability under extreme pressure. Without this foundation, even well-intentioned leaders create unnecessary conflicts and miss opportunities for effective psychological intervention that could prevent major crises. The cumulative evidence of Simba's incomplete royal education forces us to confront a provocative and uncomfortable question. Was Simba actually a successful king? Or was he simply fortunate enough to survive a series of crises that proper royal training could have prevented entirely? The answer reveals not just the tragic consequences of interrupted learning, but a disturbing pattern that threatens the very foundation of Prideland's stability for generations to come. When we step back from the emotional satisfaction of Simba's personal journey and examine his reign through the lens of systematic leadership analysis, a troubling picture emerges. Nearly every major challenge during his rule, the outsider conflict, territorial disputes, resource management crises, diplomatic failures, and family relationship problems, can be traced directly to specific gaps in his royal education. These weren't inevitable challenges that any king would face, but preventable crises that occurred because crucial knowledge died with Mufasa. The most damning evidence appears when we compare the stability and prosperity that characterized Mufasa's brief reign with the recurring conflicts and crises that defined Simba's much longer rule. Mufasa's Pridelands operated like a well-maintained system, where problems were anticipated and resolved before they escalated. Simba's Pridelands lurched from crisis to crisis, requiring dramatic interventions that, while cinematically compelling, represented fundamental failures of preventive leadership. But here's what makes this analysis truly disturbing. The cycle is repeating itself with the next generation. Both Kiara and Kion show clear evidence of receiving the same incomplete royal education that handicapped their father. Kiara's preparation for queenship appears to focus heavily on personal character development and basic leadership philosophy, but shows little evidence of systematic training in diplomacy, resource management, or psychological leadership techniques. Her eventual success in resolving the outsider crisis, while emotionally satisfying, required the same reactive crisis management that has characterized her father's reign. Even more concerning is Kion's development as leader of the Lion Guard. His education appears to emphasize magical abilities and basic tactical leadership, but shows little evidence of the sophisticated strategic thinking and systematic crisis prevention that would characterize proper royal military training. The recurring nature of threats to the Pride Lands during his tenure suggests that the Lion Guard, like the kingdom itself, operates in reactive mode rather than developing the proactive approaches that would prevent conflicts from arising. This educational pattern reveals a kingdom caught in a destructive cycle where each generation receives incomplete preparation because the previous generation lacks the systematic knowledge necessary to provide comprehensive training. The loss of institutional knowledge that began with Mufasa's interrupted education has created cascading effects that threaten the long-term stability of the Pride Land's entire governmental system. The implications extend far beyond just royal family dynamics. A kingdom led by incompletely trained rulers inevitably develops institutional weaknesses that hostile forces can exploit. The outsider crisis succeeded not because Zira was particularly brilliant, but because she recognized and exploited systematic vulnerabilities in Pride Land's governance that proper royal education would have prevented. Future threats will likely follow similar patterns, targeting the same institutional weaknesses that incomplete royal training has failed to address. Perhaps most troublingly, this analysis suggests that many of the challenges we've seen in the Pride Lands represent early stages of systematic governmental collapse rather than isolated problems. The recurring nature of territorial disputes, diplomatic failures, and internal conflicts indicates underlying institutional weaknesses that reactive crisis management cannot address. Without systematic reform of royal education and governance protocols, these problems will likely intensify rather than resolve over time. The psychological dimension adds another layer of concern. Royal leaders trained through crisis management rather than systematic education develop leadership styles that are heavily dependent on external validation and dramatic intervention. This creates a psychological need for conflict and crisis to validate their leadership effectiveness, potentially leading to unconscious escalation of problems that systematic leadership would resolve quietly. Yet, here's the most provocative aspect of this entire analysis. The Pride Land's apparent success, despite these fundamental educational gaps, might actually be masking much deeper problems. Kingdoms can survive poor leadership for surprisingly long periods before systemic failures become obvious. The Pride Land's natural resources and geographical advantages may have provided enough buffer to prevent complete collapse, but this doesn't mean the kingdom is actually thriving under incompletely trained leadership. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we actually mean by successful leadership. Is a king successful if he resolves crises through personal heroism, even if those crises could have been prevented through proper systematic governance? Is dramatic intervention actually superior to quiet prevention? Should we celebrate reactive leadership that creates compelling narratives, or should we value proactive management that prevents problems from arising in the first place? The broader implications extend beyond just fictional kingdom analysis. In our own world, how many leaders are operating with incomplete educations in crucial areas? How many organizational failures stem not from external challenges, but from systematic gaps in leadership preparation? How many crises that we treat as inevitable are actually preventable through better systematic training? Most significantly, this analysis challenges us to reconsider what we actually value in leadership. The Lion King story celebrates Simba's personal journey and his ability to overcome challenges through courage and determination. But what if this narrative has obscured a more important lesson about the crucial importance of systematic preparation and institutional knowledge preservation? The uncomfortable truth may be that Simba's reign, while emotionally satisfying and personally heroic, represents a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of interrupted education, rather than a success story about triumph over adversity. The Pride Lands may have survived his rule, but at what cost? And perhaps more importantly, what happens when the accumulated effects of generations of incomplete royal education finally exceed the kingdom's ability to absorb the consequences of systematic leadership failures? These questions don't have easy answers, but they force us to confront the possibility that everything we thought we knew about successful leadership in the Pride Lands might be fundamentally wrong.